Well, thank you for the introduction, and great to be here in Finland. It's my first time in Finland and in Helsinki, so I'm quite excited to be here on IglooConf, the summer edition. I'm not sure, is there also a winter edition that I'm not aware of? There is? Okay, I should be coming back then. Thank you, Sami, for a great security session. I will be building upon his content. I'm sure I can't exceed him, but at least I'll give you an extra perspective on all of the security things happening. Specifically in the context of ransomware. So we'll be talking about a practical example that we witnessed that was in 52 minutes. Now, I know I've got 50 minutes for this session. I'm not planning to go 2 minutes beyond, but I'll just recap how that went down. Sorry?
Like Sami did.
Like Sami did, yeah. I'll take some time back. I'll give you some more break. The agenda today is we'll do a quick introduction. Talk about the threat actors then. Afterwards, we'll go into timeline and tactics, some defensive recommendations. What can you do to prevent ransomware and exfiltration from happening? And of course, some key takeaways at the end. And if there is time, I'm happy to take questions and provide you with some answers and our perspectives. So my name is Maarten Goet. I'm from the Netherlands, as you can hear probably from the accent. I live close to Amsterdam. I've been an MVP since 2007, so I guess I'm a dinosaur MVP at this point. And I'm also regional director, which is also a Microsoft community title. I do run Holland's biggest community conference called Experts Live, which we held this week. So I was glad I could flew in on Thursday. But some people also know me in this suit because I'm a police volunteer at the criminal investigation. So I work with the cybercrime team as well as locally. And in my spare time, I try and help our police force catch the criminals. So this is me on my spare time. So this session will all be about humor. And I won't be a stand-up comedian, certainly not as good as Sami is, but we'll talk about human-operated ransomware. So not just any ransomware. This is very much driven by people, by groups, and very much tailored intelligence against your organization for them to gain financial benefits from. So the context of this talk will be human-operated ransomware, and you'll see this acronym throughout the presentation as well. So if you look at Microsoft's Digital Defense Report and how they aggregate what they are seeing in their infrastructure platforms, working with intelligence agencies around the world, what they last year concluded over 2023 is that human-operated ransomware attacks are up by more than 250%. And we saw that in Sami's talk as well. Things are accelerating. We see way much more attempts to attack, but we also see more real attacks happening where companies get hit, have full impact, and their business goes down. And secondly, this is not just for enterprise organizations. This is not just the worry of a big organization that has lots of intellectual property. What they are seeing is that 70% of organizations that are encountering human-operated ransomware had fewer than 500 employees. So all of our mid-sized companies in Europe, in Finland, are a likely target. They could also be extorted to pay money as part of their criminal operations. And so this is not just an enterprise story. This is really about pretty much every company that we have in our countries. And of course, password-based attacks are rising. Microsoft is seeing 4,000 attempts per second on their platform, so about 250,000 attempts per minute happening on Entra ID. And this is just alone from any other provider as well. So identity is still, of course, a big entry point. And then 80% of all compromises that they are seeing start or have some sort of relation with an unmanaged device. And so Sami was driving the point home that we need to patch and update our systems. The other thing we should think about, and he made the point about inventory, is those machines and endpoints and cloud resources that we have that are not under control are actually the most likely to be part of the breach going forward. So think about what you need to fix, probably get some sort of manageability in, get your patches in before you start worrying about all sorts of nifty other security tooling. And of course, when you do get a breach, you'll have damage. This could be probably a business down situation where systems are encrypted, or maybe a real damage where a CEO or a CFO has wired big sums of money away. So there will likely be a big damage where you need to rebuild your infrastructure. You can't serve your customers, so there will be indirect revenue streams impacted. But the other thing you probably are not aware of yet is that this could also be brand damage. It could be that your customers are now looking at you at a different way. Certainly at how you safeguarded the data, what did you do before the breach occurred to make it as safe as possible. But secondly, how are you disclosing and communicating when a breach happens will impact whether or not these customers will stay with you and whether your company will actually endure or get an even bigger hit for the future revenue. So these are the things that are tangible problems that you will occur happening when a ransomware will hit you or some other fraud will hit you. Now, what are the threat actors and the threats coming at your company and towards yourself? And I would say you could probably group them into 3 bigger buckets. And the first bucket, I would say, would be the young professionals, or if you want to put it differently, the script kiddies. Maybe teenagers that are digital natives. They grow up with computers and digital communications. They're probably gaming, making fun in an online world. Maybe they're losing a game and they're finding out how to steer botnets towards their friends so that their internet line gets clogged and they can still win their game. But if you look at some police research from Holland, and this is a Dutch quote, is that 50% of all the people doing cybercrime is under 20 years of old, which means that there is a chance for them to use those digital skills in a good way, but some will be attracted to forming those skills in another way. And so that's why, for instance, in Holland, we see lots of preventative programs for young people to get educated on what to do, what they shouldn't do, and the values going forward. One of those programs being Hack Shield. That's something that is actually in English, which you could do here in Finland as well, where you could educate youngsters on primary schools for them to understand these types of situations. But they're probably not your biggest concern yet. They could cause havoc. In 2018, the Dutch banking system, certainly the internet portals went down for maybe 5-6 hours, which impacted the country, driven by one teenager, but those are probably the outliers instead of the most common ones. The group you'll probably be most worrying about are the financially motivated group. And those are the groups that we all know with all the nifty names. And the word says it, they're financially motivated. It's their only reason to do this work. It's an economy in and by itself. And those are the threats you're probably encountering on a daily basis or in your threat profile start worrying and planning about. And there is a bit of a fine line between those groups and the nation states. And of course, if you hold certain specific intellectual property, if you are a national critical company, then you could be a target of a nation state. But some of these groups will actually be loyal to a nation state cause. And so there is a bit of a fine line between the groups executing the work and the nation states having the motive and the reason behind it to attack your company. But those could be coming into play depending on the type of company you are, and certainly with the world situation now rapidly declining, I would say, in our area. So what are a few of these motives? Well, it could be that they just want to get fame, certainly with the young professionals, for them to say, I've got this covered without understanding really the consequences. It could be revenge, certainly with financial groups or with youngsters. It could be financial with the financially motivated groups. Political, it could be about intelligence gathering, getting certain IP from your company or just understanding how infrastructure in a country is run. And of course, destruction. And we talked with Sami about Wiper software. Those are things that have a whole different meaning now as part of probably a fifth dimension of war. So let's rewind a bit. About 15 years ago or 10 years ago, things looked very differently. When you talked about ransomware or attacks from certain groups, you would see targeted individual systems. So maybe they, at scale, tried a certain vulnerability. They would go about targeting whole IP ranges, and they would hit certain machines depending on how things were set up. It was broad targeting, but they had a narrow impact because they landed at maybe 1 or 2 systems. And depending on which system they landed on, maybe the encryption would run because it maybe was just one generic way of trying to encrypt. And depending on your Windows version, depending on your client, depending on the software you ran, they might be able to encrypt it, but certainly not all the time, so it was a bit opportunistic. And it could cause some business harm. Maybe it was your HR system or your business processing system, but it would probably be a business down situation for the whole company, maybe a segmented impact. And so you could probably rebuild, restore, work your way around it, maybe manually do some work. And how would we do defenses? Well, probably by running some sort of enterprise antivirus solution, right? We figured if we got that at scale running, we got our networking set up, then we would be pretty safe. Well, fast forward to today, the target and the attacks we are seeing now, certainly with the human-operated ransomware, they're trying to target your entire company. They're deliberately, ahead of time, trying to figure out what is your company, how is it run, like who are the people working there, what's the infrastructure, what can we do from an open source intelligence gathering. They will have people in the loop that take that human intelligence and customize the attack towards your company very deliberately, trying to target. And then they will have all sorts of maybe encryptions and automations running so that once they get in, they can spread quickly, try and impact every machine, whether it's a virtualization platform, whether it's identities, whether it's some sort of business system. And so once they do get in and they start spreading, it's probably a guaranteed business disruption. And it is something that will take your business down and you probably can't serve your customers anymore. So what should we do from a defense perspective? Well, many, many layers. Not just one thing, probably not even 2 things, not even 10 things. There's a lot of things we should do. Get our basics in, get some sort of defense in with software, maybe do segmentation, zero networking, whatever, but it needs some sort of holistic approach, a plan that covers many, many parts of your business. And how would they then go about? Well, we all understand that they would try and encrypt and lock the data and the infrastructure that you have so that you can't access it anymore, that the application function goes down. But oftentimes before they start encrypting, they will figure out like what are the crown jewels in your company? What is the data or the intellectual property that you care about? Maybe you provide sodas and you have a recipe. Maybe you make chips and you have architectures. Maybe there's other things like patient data in hospitals that you care about that they will then identify, try and copy out, exfiltrate as we call it, before they run the encryption. And why is that? Well, even if we do get encrypted and they ask us and they extort us for money, and you figure like, okay, my morale is I won't pay, I won't negotiate, I will try and rebuild from my immutable backups, they have a second card to play and say, well, if you won't pay us, we will release this data to the public, to the market, to your competitor, or anybody else, unless you pay us. So that gives us almost a second chance for them to extort you, which is what we call exfiltration. So probably encryption, ransomware, and exfiltration are the 2 types of things you'll see them trying to achieve for them to extort. And for both things, you need some sort of solution. On the left-hand side, you'll have threat protection, all of the technical solutions. On the right-hand side, we see a rise of software solutions around data security. If you look at the Microsoft world, often start with a name of Purview, but those things like DLP and data safeguarding is something you probably use as another factor in your holistic approach for exfiltration. So I've got a short video.
We hear a lot of rumors doing this job, and one of them that just keeps coming up is that hackers are making a killing from secret payments by major companies. But what would you do if every computer in your office was hijacked by hackers? That's what happened to a Norwegian company recently, and they faced a dilemma: to pay or not to pay. The hackers attacked here late at night. Computers everywhere changed simultaneously. The message: pay us or you'll be locked out forever. For this aluminium producer, it was a disaster.
I guess the audio...
Everything was affected. Even the computer inside this clock. And it wasn't just here, it was at the company's 170 other sites around the world. 35,000 employees forced to use pen and paper.
Okay, well, I guess you understand the story. Like, this is going to be something that surprises you. This will lead to a business situation going down. So everybody will be in some sort of stressed mode to figure out what's happening, how should recover, while customers are on the phone. Production is now at a standstill. And so this is a highly stressful situation you'll be put in. And then the board or yourself will be faced with the question, okay, we're now being extorted for ransom. Should we pay the money or shouldn't we? And there's a lot of gray area, because you could say, well, there's laws that prohibit us from negotiating with criminals, right? On the other hand, many companies look at this as a business case. Like, I can pay, let's call a certain amount, 250,000 euros, maybe get a decryption key, maybe be back up later today, while if I am down for a couple of days, costing me millions of money, maybe I need to restore, costing me days, if not weeks, to get there. They're probably weighing their options between paying and not paying. And of course, if you engage with criminals, certainly for a decryption key, there's no guarantee you'll get it. But from what we see from our research, certainly in our company, is that many companies will actually consider paying and pay up the money instead of just going the royal route and rebuilding their infrastructure. Now, there's no good or bad. I don't have any final decision on this. But what you do see, and this was the case with the Thales Group, a French company, they were hit at a certain point in time for the first time. They made the decision to pay up. They got the decryption key and at one point got their infrastructure back up again. But then about a year later, they got hit again by the same type of software, which does question you how they were building their defenses. But the reason they got hit again is because those criminals understand that you're willing to pay. So there's another dimension for them to work a bit harder to get back into your infrastructure, because apparently the business case worked for you. And what we see in practice is that the amount they will charge you from bitcoins, euros, however you want to calculate it, is something that's a reasonable amount for a board to consider. It's probably percentage of your revenue where they understand it's slightly lower than lost revenue and rebuilding. So it's a complicated situation, or in a stressful situation, and then you get this question, what will you do? Well, many people actually pay. If you want to understand how these negotiations go, if you want to be the admin or the board member negotiating and chatting with those groups, the Financial Times actually created a simulator, which is quite realistic, where you could actually do this. And based on the answers you give, the simulation will adapt. So they'll put more stress on you, the amount will rise or decline. And this is actually something you should try and understand and experience, and then consider that you'll be in a stressful situation. And I'll share the slides on my social, so you don't need to note the URL, but do try this. It makes a lot of interesting insights. But like I said, for them, it's all about the money. And this was a healthcare provider in Ontario, Canada, that got faced with a ransomware attack. And they were so bold to post the chat messages that they were having with that ransomware group. And I'll give you a couple of seconds to read. But it's harsh. This is about real lives. It's about patient care. But for the criminal groups, it's just about the money. And like I said, it's really about, for them, also pushing you towards a business case and taking it very professionally almost, and trying to convince you to pay. So this is something that you'll be faced with again if you get into ransomware. It is a big economy. It's certainly not small. This is some reports from Chainalysis. This is a tool that many of our public law enforcement agencies use to track money going around in cryptocurrencies, where they can also work with crypto exchanges based on exchanges. And then last year, 2023, they saw that for the research that they were involved in, so this is probably even just a part of it, that $1.1 billion was going around in value received by ransomware attackers as part of those ransom payments. So that is a big economy. Now, apparently, they've also found a third way to extort you. If you think, well, okay, I'm going to rebuild my infrastructure, I'm going to be bold, I know you're going to release my intellectual property, but I'm not negotiating with you, I'm going to take my turns. Then Black Hat, late last year, around November, actually filed a complaint at the American SEC, so the Stock Exchange Commission, against a stock-noted company called Meridian, because they had actually hacked and ransomed Meridian. They were not reporting it to the SEC, as apparently the rules state. So they were actually filing a complaint against them, and they would actually not have if they would have paid. So for them, a third way to extort that company and get you to pay up, which is mind-blowing to me that they're finding new ways to put pressure on you. So this is economy. It's not just one group, it's not 10 groups, it's not hundreds of groups, there's literally a lot of groups involved. Some will sell you initial access where they know, like, okay, I've got this RDP port for this server, for this company for you to try at. Some will provide the encryption mechanism, so you can buy some sort of toolkit for the encryption. Some will run a platform for you. Some will do the payment help desk, if you will. And they all work together almost to provide what we call a ransomware as a server. And Microsoft has published about 1.5 years ago information about how they were seeing transactionings happen. Given the 2,500 potential target organizations for which initial access brokers sold some sort of method into that company, could be an identity, could be an RDP server open on the internet, 60 of them were encountering real activity where other groups were trying to hammer down that identity or port, try to get in or exploit that vulnerability. Of those 60, 1 out of 3 experienced a successful compromise, so they were able to take that identity or get into that server. And from that point on, of course, they need to then move about and try and wreck your infrastructure, copy out the crown jewels. And then 1 out of 20 actually saw a business down situation happen. And so given the fact that we have hundreds of thousands of organizations in our country, a lot of them will be hit by a ransomware attack over time. And this is all orchestrated by groups of ransomware together as an economy. But sometimes it's hard to identify. If you take an example from 2 years ago, a group that was marked first as Dev 0504, you see that they changed their mode of operation over time. So they started out by ransoming people with the Ryuk ransomware, then over time switched to Revil, switched over to Lockbit before trying Black Matter, then the Conti materials, and then over time started using Black Cat software. And so sometimes it's hard to understand whether or not you're dealing with group 1, group B, and also when you got your defenses in, or your indicator of compromise, or your specific use cases, you still need to fine-tune and update them over time because they'll be changing the mode of operation to be more efficient, successful, or go with some new vulnerabilities that were found. And if you look at one of the most successful groups last year, then you saw that Black Cat is the #1 most dangerous, damaging, and flexible ransomware group today. Now a polar bear that has cost over $1 billion in lost revenue. And then if you take that same Chainalysis research, you see that Black Hat by far has the most volume of payments, but also about 3/4, about 75% of all people that run into Black Hat activity will be paying up to those groups. So they're also most successful in getting you to pay. And some others were noted as well. Again, lovely research to understand. And something, of course, that the public law enforcement really is trying to be on top of. The cybercrime teams from European countries, together with Australia, the US, many others, are trying to seize and capture those groups, and sometimes they are successful. This was last week with Operation Endgame, where another ransomware group was taken down. But it's a cat and mouse game, because then overnight you see on other channels that they unseized themselves. They were able to move parts of their core infrastructure somewhere else on the internet, start operating again with their encryption kits, with providing service to all their affiliates, and unseizing themselves on a new URL and a new endpoint. So it's a cat and mouse game between law enforcement and those groups. But certainly it's great to see that the law enforcement is investing lots of time and money to do this. But again, attribution is hard. You think you're seeing one group with their activity, and then Sami already said it, maybe you're installing a Russian keyboard, it seems to be another one. So sometimes attribution is hard, and that's why Microsoft has a department in Redmond called the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, MYSTIC. Those are about 1,000+ people that work on their own platforms, so Azure, M365, what have you, to see activity there at scale and understand whether or not they should provide that as an indicator going forward. They work with intelligence agencies around the world for, of course, takedowns, but also information sharing where the law provides. And Mystic then digests that information at a couple of places. So they published the defense report, which is a great reading. They publish it as part of Microsoft Defender threat analysis, threat intelligence, I'm sorry. But they also provide it back into their products, so into Defender, into Sentinel, and many, many other places. So Mystic is quite an interesting department that they have running. Like I said, there is a Microsoft Digital Defense Report, roughly around October, November of each year. You can download it as an extensive PDF. They also publish a blog. And then the one that was published in the fall of last year, 2023, you saw one key detail is that 40% of the nation-state attacks are targeting critical infrastructure. And of course, that is why NIS2, the new European standard, is coming into law around October, November, because we need to up our game to make sure those nation-states are not successful. Now, if you look which nation-states are involved, and again, this is from Mystic, it's the ones you would see in the real world, as well as what we would call the axis of evil: Iran, China, Russia, North Korea. But again, there will be cyber mercenaries, a bit of a gray area, associating them to certain causes, some financially motivated groups also associating, and then the influence operations as well. And Microsoft, around this time last year, started a new naming convention, trying to standardize how we name the groups and the nation states involved, because you see now the new names. And activity coming out of Russia will be named Blizzard, China Typhoon, Sandstorm, etc. And then if you look at the financially motivated groups, those will be called something Tempest. So last they published a blog around Octo Tempest, and this is trying to almost replace the funky names like the Fancy Bears, the APT29s, etc. So some sort of new taxonomy that Microsoft will be using going forward. Now, interestingly enough, not only our companies and maybe ourselves as service providers are doing a lot of work in the area of cyber, but also the governments are spending a lot of time now on how to safeguard their countries. And if you look at this statistic from the UK, is that ransomware incidents now make up the majority of the emergencies for the crisis management COBRA that they have. And one country, specifically Australia, is taking a very interesting stance.
Maarten Goet and I announced with the Deputy Prime Minister yesterday that we're setting up a permanent standing operation, a partnership of new policing between the Australian Signals Directorate, which are the cyber guns of the Australian Public Service, and the Australian Federal Police. This is an entirely new model of operating for these two organisations. What they will do is scour the world, hunt down the criminal syndicates and gangs who are targeting Australia in cyber attacks and disrupt their efforts. This is Australia standing up and punching back.
And so this means that Australia is saying we will be going at this proactively. We will dedicate about 100 people at this point trying to find these groups, and even before they can hit the Australian critical companies or any company in that region, they will actually be tried to hack them, impact them before anything happens, which is an interesting, again, grey law context, but something that they're one of the first trying to do this, which is be interesting to follow and see how they go. And like I said, cyber is also the fifth dimension, of course, of warfare, apart from land, sea, air, and space. We now certainly see in Ukraine that cyber warfare is a real thing and coming up to the surface for us to see. Not only now, but certainly also in 2014, when Russia took Crimea. You saw that they're using cyber wiper malware to really do a destructive damage to critical assets, in this case, the energy sector of Ukraine. And this is why certainly this wiper malware is very, if you're a critical company, something you should be concerned about and put your defenses up for. Microsoft also published a blog by the end of 2022, around the fall, where they correlated the real world, so the attacks that Russia was doing on Ukraine as a whole, correlated it with all of the cyber attacks that they were seeing. And oftentimes, if you look at the data, you saw that Russia was first trying to do wiper software, which of course is the most easiest way for them to do this. And if they were unsuccessful, certainly missile strikes would follow in the real world, something they were trying to achieve the goal with in multiple ways. Now, if this all dazzles you, I've got good news. There's a non-profit organization called MITRE that's trying to provide you with all of the information around the groups that are active, their tools, tactics, and procedures, information about the things you could do to prevent those attacks. This is a non-profit organization. It's becoming the de facto standard. So if you're running some sort of cyber software, you often see T numbers. Those T numbers correlate with knowledge articles on the MITRE website. And it's free, so you can go to the MITRE website and get also attack matrices for your organization. So what are the kill chain phases we have for Azure? What are the tools, tactics, and procedures for Azure? But certainly also for ICS, so your production environments or any other platform like AWS, GCP, whatever, or on-prem. So the attack matrices and their knowledge-based articles are very, very helpful. Now they align them with 12 phases of the cyber kill chain. So they've got information on initial access, discovery, execution, which runs some sort of software on an endpoint, lateral movement, persistence, etc., all the way down to impact, which is when they'll be flipping the switch, running the encryption for you to get a business down situation. And these are example knowledge-based articles that you can download. They're updated quite frequently. You see the technique, you see sub-techniques, what platforms, how they run, some sort of procedures, sample software. This is very helpful if you want to understand certain ways, like, for instance, the adversary in the middle. Now, there's a lot of articles. So one of the things that Roberto Rodriguez did, one of the researchers at Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, is build a custom GPT, which indexes that software, and then you can ask natural language questions about what are the most prevalent attack factors for my industry, or what are the most new attack factors, or what are the ways an attacker could abuse PowerShell or WMI, etc. And so this is something you could open up, ask your question, take a couple of seconds, and it would actually provide you with the information. That's something I find very useful, and probably see that coming through other ways as well in the future, like with Security Copilot. So what are the timeline and tactics in our example where the attacker went from initial access to full breach in 52 minutes? Well, if you look at initial access, you probably worry about all of the things you see in the news, right? Was it a 0 day? Probably not. You often see things like just an RDP open, really the basics that you need to worry about. They're not simple because it's a lot of work and you might not have visibility everywhere, but the basics are probably the things you should worry about most when you look at initial access and not per se that nifty 0-day that came out today. Mitre groups them into almost 5 categories, how they could get initial access to your company. First category, exploit some sort of vulnerability in an internet-facing service. So you've got something running on the internet, it has a vulnerability, maybe a web vulnerability, and that could be an initial way to get into a part of your infrastructure. And I'm noting the T numbers so that when you do get the slides, you could look them up in the knowledge base articles for more depth and relevance. Second category, abusing internet-facing authentication mechanisms, Entra ID, Okta, some sort of custom login that you have for your software that will get some sort of abuse and they get in with an identity. Third, phishing, still very relevant, trying for you to click on something to run some sort of software on an endpoint that then is a stepping stone into a next phase. Of course, gaining physical access to a network, dropping a Raspberry Pi in your warehouse, something behind your printer, mystery guest that comes in and tries this. And the fifth is supply chain attacks, and you could look at that 2 ways. It could be some sort of managed service provider in your company providing services but has admin rights, whatever, they get breached. Or the other way around, software versions with packages, NuGets, NPMs, whatever, that has some sort of vulnerability that gets abused as part of a supply chain software attack. So those are the 5 categories that Mitre actually sees. And identity is still one of the really strong ones that initial access gets abused from. Why? Well, it's the new control plane. Identity provides you with the authentication and the authorization. Through the pandemic, we saw an acceleration of remote work, so identity becomes the single point for you to focus on. Many still have vendors in your environment, and are you doing the daily hygiene for them to make sure you have lifecycle management or least amount of rights, etc.? And of course, that means that we often have too many rights and access. So still a lot of, and I guess the majority of those attacks have something to do with identity. And this is, again, not just enterprises or mid-size. Even nation states are quite successful in abusing identities. If you looked at how Microsoft was breached last year in November, it started with a password spray attack. It's mind-blowing to me, but this is still initial access and something to worry about. So identity is a good starting point on your defenses. But spear phishing, certainly something that we should look at. Haven't we all got some sort of email where some file was shared with us? You click this and it's trying to load something. Well, spear phishing is still so very relevant. And why? Because they're trying to abuse our human nature, how we respond to things in real life. And that's why things like a coworker scheduling a meeting for tomorrow for you to accept or decline might have a good chance for you to click on. Or, hey, did you see this new cat picture? You might click on that as well. It's all about human behavior that they're trying to exploit. So these are the things that you should worry about. And because we've got these new tools, AI, large language models, they can make it very specific for you, for your company, in that branding, context, or time. And that's why phishing is actually still on the rise, even though it's been with us for quite a time. What often happens then is you got launched into some sort of website where it's asking you to log in to see that meeting or to download that OneDrive file. But it would be an adversary in the middle, so they stand up some sort of copy that looks like the Microsoft login, but it certainly is not. And some of us as professionals will probably recognize it based on URL or other properties, but a regular user might not. And if you think this is hard, well, go and follow John Hammond on YouTube. He has a 20-minute video on setting up Evil Engine X, and you could be running your own adversary in the middle attack in the next hour, which is worrying because if he can do it in 20 minutes, we all can do it in 20 minutes. And so we see a lot of rise in attack in the middle. They capture it. They capture your identity from a name and password perspective, but then you would say, okay, but I've got multi-factor authentication set up, right? So no need to worry about that. Well, we saw that a lot of the companies in the past, of course, only had the approval MFA, where you go like decline or approve. And you would decline it the first time, maybe they try it again, decline it the second time. By the time they get to the 10th, the 11th, the 12th one, there might be some fatigue where you go like, okay, this is some random app trying to prompt me now, I'll just hit allow. Maybe not as professionals, but certainly our users will find the fatigue and hit approve. And the most recent proof that it works was with the Uber attack and the Okta attack last year, where MFA spamming, as we call it, and the MFA fatigue got them a cookie and a session cookie for them to continue on. And we'll talk about number matching in a second. But spear phishing, again, not only just for enterprises, even with nation states are trying to target operators of energy stations for them to click on initial software for them to load the micro-malware. So even the CERT of Ukraine is publishing information that they're seeing spear phishing happen. So onwards to the attack. This is what the customer saw. Initial access, spear phishing, somebody clicked on it, launched the adversary in the middle attack, MFA spamming, and by the MFA fatigue, they hit approve, got themselves a cookie. Then they need to persist in some way, so they enrolled a virtual device, changed the MFA settings on that account. Then they needed persistence in the environment, so they created scheduled tasks, which is still a thing, unfortunately. Running SSH and installing beacons, as we call them, in Cobalt Strike, this platform that many attackers use as communication and control, all in the time of a few minutes. Then they used RDP in packet, which tries to mimic certain protocols, PSExec and remote service creation for the lateral movement, because it was a non-segmented environment. Credential access, so trying to figure out some clear text passwords in memory, enabling WDigest, and then also tooling to access the ntds.dit, so your Active Directory on-prem, through volume shadow copies. And then, of course, going through disabling antivirus with a vulnerable anti-rootkit driver, first exfiltrating data out through SCP, but the process was masqueraded as lsas.exe with one S. It mixed a bit in the normal traffic, and then they executed the encryption, and the ransom note was displayed, all in a time of 52 minutes. Why? They automate themselves. They do the human intelligence ahead of time, but the time they're running their Cobalt Strike platform, they have lots of automations for them to do the lateral movement, to try the execution, and to exfiltrate data and start the encryption at scale. So at 52 minutes, this customer actually experienced a business down situation. And so I've got a question for you. How much time do you think it would take to encrypt 100,000 files? And I know you're going to ask me, like, how fast was the processor and the disk? And we'll take an average machine for now. Who thinks it's going to take 8 hours? Okay, nobody noble to do 8 hours. 3 hours? Anybody? Okay, so you're torn between 3 hours, 21 minutes? Okay, we got a good group going on. 4 minutes, anybody? Oh, the other half of the group. Okay, so what they're seeing in research is that this takes on average 4 minutes. Why? Because it's all multi-threaded on your processor, it's multi-process, it's all parallel, nothing is sequential. And that is also the same thing if you look at machines. You could take one machine, but really, like Sami just said, it just takes under 2 hours to get your whole environment down. Why? Automation, parallel threading, making sure everything executes at the same time. So within probably already the first 30 to 60 minutes, you'll see many infrastructure going down, and that will continue onwards. So this is something where you don't have a lot of time, where you need to do some preventative measures so that it doesn't happen, but also some reactive measures like a SOC, like an MDR, for them to step in quickly and circumvent. So what could you do? Well, we could do some things. Start with the basics. And again, it's not going to be easy, so I'm not downplaying this. Making sure you got your identities locked down, use proper things like MFA, patch, get visibility are not simple things to do, but our software allows for it. In Active Directory and Enter, we got lots of things we can do, password protections, etc. If you're doing MFA, and this was enabled by default in May 23, do number matching, so they can't just do allow or decline. They need to retype a number they only have in their screen that the other person doesn't have. So number matching is a bit of an annoyance we see for users, of course. It's a bit of a steeper hurdle. On the other hand, it's one of those things that will really provide you with a defensive layer, because this is not something they can do the MFA fatigue anymore. You could spend some more money on Microsoft tooling, do things like identity protection, see anomalies, see odd behavior and get auto block modes, or use things like Defender for Identity, where it's tapping into your Active Directory, finding LDAP queries, finding traffic over your certificate services, but also things like honey accounts, honeypots, if you will, where you in regular use would never use it. But if they do enumeration, that honey token would be hit, and it would be a high fidelity alert for your SOC. And then really one of the Swiss Army knives, if you will, is the Defender for Endpoint, the EDR solution, where you could run this on your servers, you could run it on your endpoints, and it just doesn't only look at the known knowns. This is not just some sort of antivirus solution where we only publish the things that we already found in the wild. Now, this takes also normal behavior from your endpoint, what's normally running in memory or CPU, etc., and then start to block that. It can correlate between the cloud engine, so at scale for your company or across tenants. And this is something that provides a lot of value, is what we're seeing, EDR solutions in your environment. And one of the things that Microsoft came out with is Deception. It's now in preview. So it will mimic your infrastructure, the IP addresses, the naming, the files that you go using on that station, but it will only be in memory. It will only be there as fake decoys, as honeypots, if you will. Again, if enumeration happens, if things start to do on that machine that will access many more things than a normal user or a normal business process would do, those would be 100% high fidelity alerts for your SOC to look at. And this is just enabled by default that you can start using. It's auto-configured. It uses ML to just understand over time the naming conventions you have. You could use Defender for Cloud, look at your Azure platform from a fundamental perspective, or again, some of the resources there. But look mainly at the attack path. So what is my exposure? How could this account give me access to a certain network, to a certain storage account, or something else that will be part of that kill chain? And for you to understand what route would be the most prevalent and start working on that as a high priority, for instance. And then if you want to dive deeper from a threat intelligence perspective on the groups targeting you and your company, look at MDTI. Zoom in and start to work your way. And then get that all back into what they now call Defender XDR, correlate things from Defender for Endpoint for identity alerts, map it back to the MITRE attack kill chains, to the certain articles, group it as an incident instead of separate alerts, but also use a visual representation with actionable items for you to work at or for your SOC to work at. And then if you want to add other environments, your networking environment, your production environment, custom data, logging, like Sami talked about, then you can enrich that with Microsoft Sentinel, which is the SIEM solution. Again, all multi-cloud, AWS, GCP, Azure. But they're adding in a security copilot, so an LLM, which makes it easier for us, because then we can ask, like, what does the script do? Who was hit? Maybe get some actionable items that we can work on, something that's now in preview. But what we really need is, if those attackers are automating themselves, we need to automate ourselves. Otherwise, they'll be quicker. We can't respond in time. So we need to defend at machine speed. Because if we see an anomaly where a processor is using all sorts of encryption threads that is normally not the case for a normal business operation, we could ask the machine to step in and say, okay, start blocking this process ahead of time before bad things happen. But you need high fidelity. And how do you achieve high fidelity? Well, honey tokens could be one way. The other way is correlate at least 2 sources. Because on one source, you could be chasing your tail. Identity, abnormal login from Helsinki. Well, Maarten is today in Helsinki, so the SOC needs to analyze, take a lot of bandwidth for them to understand it's false or true positive. What if it was correlated with the VPN, with my agenda, with some sort of other login? At least 2, 3, or 4 signals together. That's when you often see that the confidence goes up and the fidelity goes up. And that's what Microsoft is trying to do with automatic attack disruption. Take at least 3 signals, high fidelity signals, build up the confidence, and then let you decide, okay, at this point of confidence, I want the system to step in, block port, block an account, eradicate a process in memory, etc., to do coordinated action, what normally your SOC would do. They've got lots of use cases in there now. They're coming up with new ones every month. And this is, to me, one of the really exciting parts of the Defender suite is getting into this automatic attack disruption and trying to move at the machine speed quicker than our adversaries can do. And certainly also for business scenarios, not just threat scenarios. So key takeaways. Well, if you're interested in this type of thing, one person to follow is Kevin Beaumont. Really exciting on X, LinkedIn, wherever he sits about, maybe Blue Sky. But here's something that does a lot of early reporting, details analysis, and he's not shy of telling an unsalted opinion. Other takeaways, threats are accelerating. Have a plan, start with a plan. Fix the basics. It's not easy, but maybe target your identities first. Get some sort of visibility in with an integrated solution, I would say. And if you're interested in Microsoft, learn Microsoft Security. You have a lot of interesting things. Like Sami said, it's not a matter of if, but when. And for those who know the Schrodinger's cat, I would say it's the Schrodinger's hack. So you will be hacked at one point in time, so better be ready for it now. Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center publishes a really nice podcast where they explain all of these actors, where the security analyst is really on the podcast episode itself. Join this guy in Hungary later in September if you want to get more Sami awesome. And I thought I should end with a Finnish saying, one of the greats in our area, Mikko Hipponen. We are no longer securing computers, we are securing society. So let's all chime in and make a safer world. Thank you.